I also first want to say thank you for inviting me here, because for me it is a wonderful opportunity to discuss or reflect a bit on a problem that has been on my mind for some time right now. As has been said in the introduction, I'm a researcher in violence and conflict studies. I have been on ethnographic researches, on field researches in 3 war-affected countries for longer time, in Angola, in Mozambique, and in Afghanistan. And again, coming back from these places, I had these moments where I have been asking myself, if not art, the language of art would be more adequate to express, or the languages of art would be more adequate to express what I felt to have understood about these places than the language of science, of social sciences. I will use this opportunity to explain a bit where this feeling comes from, because it has to do with social science methods. It also has to do with a history of thought in Europe. Why it sometimes feels so difficult to communicate insights from field research in war-affected countries. I have many times made the experiences that when I came back from these war zones, let's use this dramatic word, and I wanted to talk about it to people, other researchers, to colleagues, to students, that it felt difficult to make myself understood. If I'm looking for a metaphor, I would say it felt like if you would be communicating in a soundproof cabin. So you try to be as articulate as you can, and the other also tries to understand what you're saying, but somehow you have the feeling you cannot really, the message isn't really getting over to the other person. This is not true as long as you want to talk about the horrors of war. This is very easy to, a message that is very easy to convey. But the moment you step out of this, the moment if you want to talk about other aspects of life in war zones, there seems to be little resonance for many people. Not for older people who might have lived through the end of the Second World War themselves, not for people from, let's say, the Balkans, not for people in Africa. When I work with students who come from the global south, to them usually it's not very difficult to connect to it. But to try to communicate this message, let's say, in the heart of modern European societies, it is somehow difficult. Why is this so? I think one aspect simply has to do with the method of ethnographic field research itself. So ethnography means you try to understand a place by becoming, for a certain period of time, a part of this place yourself. So you go there, you engage, you talk to people, you observe what they are doing, you share their life. So ethnographic research is always a personal experience. And then you have to take a step back and have to try to turn this into an analysis and bring this into academic writing at some point. This is always challenging, and this always involves question of text composition and processes that are maybe not so unlike certain processes in artistic production. So all ethnographers share this particular problem. But there's one problem that is especially pronounced when you talk about violent conflict. And this is the expectations people have when you talk about this issue. People will expect you to tell them something about disorder, about emergencies, about horrors, about cruel things. And when you try to talk about something else, it might become difficult. And I will look at these 2 problems because they are separate but somehow interrelated. And turn and hope in doing this also explain a bit about the work I have been doing and what you can see when you do this kind of work. So the second problem, the expectations people have when you start talking about armed conflict, has to do with the status, with the place violence has in Western thinking. So there is a special place for violence and everything around it in Western thought. And in general, you could say the position is that from the perspective of modern European societies, violence is always a problem of others. It's never here with us, it is always a problem of others. It is other places, other times. And it's also this feeling that this is what is distinctive about modern European societies, having overcome the problem of violence by the establishment of functioning nation state that wield the monopoly of legitimate use of force, by a certain taming of spirit, so we all control ourselves, so as not to hit each other once we get angry. And this is, even if civilization theories have gone out of fashion, this is still a very fundamental assumption. And you can see this, for example, if you look at the discourses that come up when violence can be observed in Europe. It's, for example, when there were the wars in former Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia suddenly became the Balkans. So the Balkans, we do not really know whether this is part of Europe. It seems that historically it never really was. If you look at the riots in European cities, who is rioting? It must be children of migrants or migrants themselves, so people whose belonging is also not very clear. So there are all kinds of discursive feats performed to uphold this idea, because of course violence did not disappear from European societies. How does this affect now research, social science research, this assumption, this unreflected assumption? First, it guides the choice of topics and it guides the approaches employed when dealing with this problem. So usually, still a lot of research you will find is actually about making things better. It is about why there is violence. How can we end it? Compared to all this literature, the literature that actually tries to understand what is happening if there is a war, it is still in the social sciences. It is still a much smaller part. Let's put it this way. And this is a different approach than social scientists approach a lot of other topics. So if we study schools, of course we also study why people are going there or maybe why they don't want to go there. But then we study what is going on in a school. But it has taken quite a while until sociologists actually started asking what is going on in a war. Not only why there was a war and how can we end it. But there is a more subtle second effect of this image of modern Western society having overcome the problem of violence. It makes that it creates a tendency to perceive context where you can actually see violence as being fundamentally different from our world. So, because we believe that Europe is where the problem of, and modernity in Europe is the place where the problem of violence has been overcome, we believe that places where there is violence must be fundamentally different from us, from our world. A consequence of this is that there seems to be an assumption that common sociological knowledge does not really apply. So we need special theories and we need experts to deal with these problems. You will see in this literature frequently a language of orderlessness. Talking about war zones, you will find these metaphors of orderlessness, a collapse of social order. There was a time in the late 1990s where even the metaphor of the state of nature was quite frequently to be found. I recently met some colleagues in Paris who do work on the systems of justice that are established in Taliban-governed areas in Afghanistan. And they told how they how their first presentation to an academic public ended. It was that from the audience, there was but one question. The title of the presentation was Justice Systems of the Taliban. And the only question the people in the audience asked was, do you want to tell us the Taliban are just? Of course, they didn't want to tell the Taliban are just. Justice is a very fundamental notion in political thinking. And everybody would agree that justice is a very important aspect of every social order. So we could look for justice systems in any place, but somehow it seems to be illegitimate to employ this notion when talking about areas that are governed by an armed group, especially an armed group like the Taliban. So here you can see this tendency to look for special theories, to look for experts who can explain this disorderliness or this chaos. But there has been a critique towards this approach. And the critique has also gained, how to say, in weight or in importance because there have been quite a number of failed humanitarian intervention, quite a number of failed peace-building projects. And there was a growing understanding that we have to understand more what is happening inside a war zone. And against this background, a research community emerged that tries to look at life in war zones from a micro perspective. And among them, you will also find quite a number of ethnographers. And what is this is just a tangent, but what is in a way funny is that although the study of war and conflict is still very much a man's domain, among the ethnographers, you find a lot of women. My personal perception is that there are even more women doing this work than men. But this is just a tangent. So ethnography might be a method that might help you to move you out of these images of war zones as being something outside of everything that we would consider modern, contemporary, and can help you to understand the order of a place. Because if there was no social order, you actually couldn't do ethnographic field research. So ethnography means you go someplace and then you have a particular question, but whatever your particular question is, you somehow have to get along. You have to get up in the morning, you have to eat, you have to go out, you need transportation. And in just trying to do what you want to do, you somehow have to learn the rules that govern this place. So, and you will find them. I don't want to say that you could do ethnographic research in every area, and maybe some ethnographies can be only undertaken by some people, so it would be difficult for me to research right-wing extremists in Europe. And if I would somehow succeed, it would be a very particular project. So ethnography is always a very dense personal experience because you go as somebody and you are perceived as somebody by the persons in the field, but then you have to use this to develop an analysis, to develop concepts, to bring this into dialogue with existing theories. In my case, in my first field research in Angola, I wanted to understand how war can become a normal reality. And this, again, is already a topic that somehow embarrassed people when I talked about this. How can you research this? War can never be normal. Of course, war can never be normal in a normative sense, but to all these people who are living under these conditions, it becomes part of their everyday, and I was interested in understanding how this is possible. I went there at the time when I left. This was PhD research. I had a little daughter who was roughly a year old, so I had to take her with me, and my husband also came with me, and we lived in a little house in the city that was still very much affected by the war, but the war was technically over, so the peace agreement had been signed 2 years before. And I got into contact with people and tried to make them talk about how they had managed their life under the conditions of war. Many of the conversations weren't really interviews, but they were people were invited to the house, and I served them some coffee or drink, or we had dinner, and then we got into these discussions. The main insight from this research was that I did not really get stories of victimization. I was very concerned that I'm going to meet all these traumatized people. And I even contacted people who are specialized in dealing or in treating trauma patients to understand what would I have to do if somebody would actually get a flashback during an interview or a conversation. It actually never happened, because what I was asking of those people was a chance to explain how they actually had lived through the situation, and it was something that was very much important to their dignity. So what they would tell me was how they managed their everyday life, but in many occasions, it little bit felt like upholding everyday life under these conditions was something close to a hero's deed, because conditions were so difficult. What they explained to me was how they try to maintain what they consider to be an ordinary life. And their concerns were not so different from our own concerns. So it was about raising their children, cultivating the fields, getting education, finding employment, finding love. So everything that is important to most people in this place of the world. But interestingly, what I understood, or what I could see in the end, was that all the creativity and effort people put into maintaining this normal life, which did as if it had nothing to do with the war, was a way of, also contributed to stabilizing the order of the war. So one of the main analytical insights of this work was that although we might think that the social order of war is mainly imposed by people with guns, in the interviews I could actually see, in the conversation, looking at how the people were dealing with their everyday, that their very creativity also contributed to the stabilization of the social order. Because going on with your life means not resisting. But under the conditions which they were, you can ask yourself, what would it have meant to resist? I mean, this is not now some kind of heroic ideal, but you could see what it would have meant to resist under these conditions. And it became it was a situation where it was very difficult to uphold very strong moral distinctions. Just to give you one example, which for me expresses this moral messiness of the situation, was a conversation that I had with a very dignified elderly woman, whom I asked about the situation of women during the war and violence against women during the war. And I was prepared to hear now all the horrors nobody had told me before. But actually her answer was, you know, soldiers always fight, and they have only violence in their head. And sometimes they need to relax, and then to do this, they need a woman. They take a woman. And I was so stupefied by this answer that I couldn't even formulate a follow-up question, because I thought, wow, she just defended rape, or she defended the rapist. And then I was asking myself afterwards, but how can you explain this? How can a woman say something like this? And we never talked again, so I couldn't ask her, but I think one hypothesis is that maybe it's something like this happened to her, and it is a way for her to make sense of this situation and preserving her dignity. Or, which is maybe even more probable, she knows or she suspects that a man close to her, her husband, her brother, her son, has done something like this. And it is a way to preserve her relation to them. And it is, for me, it is this little anecdote expresses in a symbolic way how morally messy the situation is. And I have come to think that I think for nobody it is really possible to maintain a clean vest. So it's not about just taking up a gun or not, shooting somebody or not. It is very difficult to stay a moral person under these conditions. The research I have undertaken this spring in Afghanistan was another very interesting experience for two reasons. Because first, I was confronted massively with the first problem I have talked about, with the images which dominate in the West about these war-affected places. Before this research, during this research, after this research, I feel I could just write a book about the reactions I got from people when I told them I'm going to Afghanistan for research. There was everything from sincere concern for my security to outrage, how irresponsible I am, being a mother, going to such a place. And the argument that people are living in this place, quite many of them, each and every day, didn't really count. So this was a first interesting experience, and the second interesting experience then was that being in Afghanistan, which now was actually a hot conflict, in Angola it was very much post-conflict already. I lived through all these processes of adaptation and habituation that I had tried to describe for Angola myself, which was interesting because in a way I feel like somehow I felt that basic concepts were confirmed, but of course living through it you understand that everything is much more complex than you thought. So now I feel I have a more nuanced understanding of how such a situation feels, but now the challenge, of course, is to put this into an analytic language, into concepts, to make this talk to existing theories in social sciences. So to sum this up a bit, and to come back to the first problem I mentioned, I think ethnography might be a way out, or a way to create different images about zones of conflict, about war zones. But the problem that you encounter is that you make a very dense personal experience, and then you have to distance yourself from this experience. You have to turn actual people that you met into figures in an academic text, and it feels sometimes unsatisfactory or inadequate, and sometimes even wrong, what you do to the material that you have gathered, because it's not just the material you found in an archive, it's your personal experience, it's relationships you entertained with people. And these are the moments where I also thought, well, maybe writing a novel would be better than trying to write a book in social sciences. But still, I believe it is important to do this for the sake of social sciences itself. So if somebody wants to tell me now, maybe literary persons or writers are better equipped to express what you try to express in academic language, I think I would quickly agree, but I think it is important for further developing theoretical concepts and methods in social sciences, in sociology, to stay with this problem. Because as social scientists, we do not only describe worlds, we also enact them, we create them in writing. So it does matter how we describe them. And my feeling is that research on armed conflict has very much contributed to describing war-affected regions as places very far away, inhabited by victims and perpetrators, and also in assuring people living in modern Western societies of the importance of the project of modernity. And the value of Western civilization. And in doing this, it has contributed to this gap that separates Europe, this ideal Europe, from the rest of the world. And I think that research, in my field of research, so research on armed conflict differently undertaken, that works in a way to show actually the human faces which are not so unlike our own, of people in these war zones, can also contribute to closing this gap, to bringing people closer together. And I think you can maybe do it more easily in art, but I think for social sciences, it is important to try to do this in science also. Thank you very much.